Max Verstappen finished 11th in the only practice session of his home race weekend. On paper, that's the headline. The kind of stat that would normally dominate every recap of the session, the sort of number pundits build entire pre-race narratives around. It's also, in the bigger picture, the least important thing that happened to him this weekend. Because on the same day he looked like a midfield driver on the timing screens, struggling to find rhythm on a track he's dominated for years, Verstappen made what might be the single biggest decision of his career. And it had nothing to do with lap times at all, or with anything that happened inside the cockpit that day. A decision that will shape the next several years of his career far more than any single Friday afternoon ever could. Some context on why this weekend already carried extra weight before a wheel was even turned. Zandvoort is hosting the Dutch Grand Prix for the final time under its current agreement with Formula One, meaning this was billed everywhere, in every preview and every broadcast, as Verstappen's last guaranteed home race. His record here is genuinely remarkable. 3 wins and 2 second-place finishes across 5 appearances since the race returned to the calendar in 2021. A run very few drivers at any home circuit anywhere on the calendar have ever come close to matching. The whole weekend arrived dressed as a goodbye, tributes planned, records on the line, the timing screens ready to write one final storybook chapter for a circuit that's given him some of the best days of his career, the kind of send-off broadcasters had clearly been planning for months in advance. Then practice actually started, and the story on track refused to cooperate with the script everyone had already written for it. Here's what actually happened in FP1. Kimi Antonelli topped the session in damp, drying conditions, with Lando Norris close behind him throughout. Verstappen ended up 11th, 1 1/3 seconds off the pace, behind cars including a Racing Bulls and an Audi, machinery that wouldn't normally be within a second of a 4-time champion at his own home track. He wasn't alone in struggling either. Several drivers slid into the gravel as the track dried unevenly through the session, Verstappen included, along with Carlos Sainz and Lewis Hamilton on separate occasions during the same hour. But for a driver being celebrated all weekend as the king of this circuit, a driver with 3 wins in 5 visits here and a fan base that turns the entire grandstand orange, 11th in the only practice session on offer is a genuinely rough way to start what's supposed to be a farewell weekend. There's a second problem buried in that session too, one with real consequences stretching well beyond this single weekend. Both Verstappen's and teammate Liam Lawson's Red Bulls were fitted with a 3rd MG UK at Zandvoort, the maximum allocation permitted under this year's regulations for that specific component. Any further change to that component for the rest of the season now triggers an automatic grid penalty. No exceptions, no appeals process to soften the blow. That's not a hypothetical risk sitting somewhere in the future, the kind of thing that might matter eventually if things go wrong down the line at some unspecified later date. That's a ceiling Red Bull has already hit right now on a car that spent the whole season fighting weight issues, wing failures, and inconsistent balance, with no real margin left to absorb another setback between now and December. One more reliability problem between now and the season finale in Abu Dhabi, and Verstappen starts a race from the back of the grid through absolutely no fault of his own, purely because the component ran out of allocation months earlier than anyone at Red Bull would have liked. Okay, before we go any further, make sure you're smashing that hype button because this is where the actual story of the weekend starts. Because while all of that was happening on track, in full view of every camera, the actual news of the weekend had already landed quietly behind the scenes. Verstappen signed a contract extension with Red Bull through the end of 2030, announced on Media Day, right as this farewell narrative was building around him across every outlet covering the race. Talks had reportedly been finalized weeks earlier, back at the Austrian Grand Prix, but the announcement itself was deliberately held back and timed specifically for his home race, maximizing the moment rather than just quietly filing the paperwork somewhere less significant. By the time this deal runs out, Verstappen will have spent 15 seasons with Red Bull, the longest driver-team pairing in the sport's history by a considerable margin. A run that started back when he was still a teenager without a full road license, promoted mid-season with barely any warning at all. One outlet covering the news put it plainly: This wasn't just good for Verstappen financially, it was good for Red Bull and good for Formula One as a business, all at once, across every level of the sport. Here's the part that actually explains why he signed in his own words rather than in anyone else's interpretation of the situation. Verstappen specifically credited team principal Laurent Mekies, who took over from Christian Horner last year, under genuinely difficult circumstances. Getting to work with Laurent now for over a year has also been great. I see a clear vision he has for the team. That's worth sitting with for a second because it directly contradicts a story we've covered before on this channel, the idea that Red Bull was in a state of internal panic, restricting information internally and mismanaging its own drivers' feedback out of fear of what might leak elsewhere. My honest take: this doesn't erase everything we've reported about tension inside Red Bull this season, the ignored feedback, the contractual standoffs, the internal caution around information sharing that we documented in real time. But it does tell you clearly that those problems, real as they genuinely were, weren't deal breakers in the end, whatever the headlines suggested at the time or however dramatic they may have looked from the outside. Whatever friction existed along the way, Verstappen decided Mekies' broader direction was worth committing 4.5 more years of his career to. So here's the honest read on Zandvoort so far. Once you separate what actually matters from what just looked dramatic on a Friday afternoon in the Dutch sunshine. On track, nothing has changed. The car is still inconsistent. He's still fighting for positions he used to win from comfortably, and he's now one mechanical failure away from a grid penalty for the remainder of the year. Off track, everything has changed. The biggest source of uncertainty hanging over this entire season, where does Max Verstappen actually race next year, is completely gone, resolved before a single point was even on the line this weekend. Those two stories aren't in conflict with each other. They're just running on different timelines, one measured in tenths of a second, the other measured in years of a career. Whatever happens in sprint qualifying and Sunday's race, the actual headline of this weekend already happened in a press release before a single competitive lap was even set, which is either fitting or ironic depending on how you look at it. Sprint qualifying and the race itself are still to come, the real test of whether Zandvoort still has one last Verstappen storybook ending left in it before the circuit disappears from the calendar for the foreseeable future. We'll be tracking every single session between now and then. Smash that hype button, subscribe, and we'll see you at the checkered flag.